Baby, it's almost done. Then he'll be gone forever.
The rain hit the windshield like shattered glass, each drop echoing the pounding in Ethan Calloway's chest. His hand trembled as he held the phone, the dim glow of the street lamp slicing through the darkness outside his apartment window. A voice, smooth yet chilling, whispered on the other end, "Baby, it's almost done. Then he'll be gone forever." His stomach twisted, a cocktail of disbelief and dread suffocating him. The words didn't make sense. Who? What? How could the woman he loved, the one he trusted with everything, speak so casually about someone disappearing? And yet, the conviction in her tone left no room for doubt. The world felt suddenly colder, smaller, filled with shadows he had never noticed before. Ethan's pulse raced, his reality shattered, leaving behind only questions and a promise of chaos yet to come. Before we dive deeper into this twisted tale, comment your current location and local time below. I'm curious where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe to follow Ethan's shocking journey. Ethan Calloway had always believed that love, once given, was a fortress impervious to betrayal. That morning, as the first thin streaks of sunlight bled through the blinds, he lay on the edge of their king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconstruct the fragments of the nightmare from the night before. Lydia had been quiet for days, the way a storm lingers over a town before it finally breaks, and he had chalked it up to stress from work, exhaustion, or perhaps the invisible weight of their routines. Yet, the phone call, her words still echoed in his mind, twisting his very sense of reality. It wasn't the words themselves, but the deliberate ease in her voice. The way she pronounced "almost done," as though she were announcing the completion of a mundane chore. That voice had always been a harbor, a melody of comfort and love, but now it was a blade sliding effortlessly between his ribs. He swung his legs off the bed, bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor, each movement measured and slow, as if prolonging the moment of disbelief. His apartment, once a sanctuary filled with laughter and the quiet hum of a shared life, now seemed alien. The walls, once witnesses to whispered secrets and late-night confessions, stood indifferent, their beige paint muted and lifeless under the morning light. Even the furniture, familiar and reliable, seemed to judge him, silent accomplices to a domestic life he could no longer trust. Ethan's hands were shaking. He picked up his coffee mug, half full from the night before, and stared into its dark, bitter contents, as if the liquid could offer answers. But it offered nothing. Only the reflection of his own wide, fearful eyes stared back. The morning passed in a haze of suspicion and unease. Ethan replayed the phone call again and again, each iteration revealing something new, some nuance he had missed in his initial shock. Was it Derek Hayes she was referring to? The man she had occasionally mentioned, a colleague of hers who had always struck Ethan as overly friendly, or was it something or someone else entirely? The questions multiplied like shadows lengthening at dusk, consuming every corner of his mind. He remembered her smile from last night, the soft way she had brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, entirely ordinary, entirely unthreatening. How could the same woman, who smiled like sunlight, whisper something so cold, so lethal, into his ear? As he walked through the apartment, Ethan's gaze fell on photographs, the framed images of birthdays, anniversaries, and vacations frozen in time. Each image now felt like a lie. There was Lydia, laughing in the sun at a beach, a necklace glinting against her dark skin, the kind of carefree joy that had once anchored him. And there was himself, smiling foolishly, oblivious. Wrapped in the comfort of trust, he felt an ache in his chest, a physical weight pressing down, as if his ribcage had been swapped for stone. He wanted to smash the pictures, tear them from the walls, but some primal hesitation held him back. To destroy them would be to acknowledge the betrayal, to give form to the nightmare, and yet leaving them untouched felt like letting a poison fester, unseen but deadly. By mid-morning, Ethan had forced himself into a routine, the kind one employs to stave off panic. He showered, shaved, dressed in his usual gray suit, tying his tie with hands that refused to obey. He moved mechanically, rehearsing words he would never speak, planning conversations that might never occur. In his mind, every interaction with Lydia over the past weeks came under scrutiny. Each sentence she had uttered analyzed for hidden meaning, every gesture reinterpreted through the lens of suspicion. He remembered the subtle flicker in her eyes when he had complimented her hair the day before, the quick glance at her phone before she slipped it into her bag, the way her laugh had seemed just slightly too rehearsed, small details, almost invisible, that now screamed like alarms in a deserted house. Ethan left the apartment, deciding to walk rather than drive, needing the rhythm of his steps to ground him. The city streets were wet from the previous night's rain, reflecting the bright neon signs in fractured, distorted patterns. Each puddle he stepped in seemed to ripple outward, like the consequences of Lydia's words expanding into his life. He passed by the coffee shop where they had first met, where she had laughed at some private joke, a sound that had once lit up his world. Now it was a memory taunting him, a cruel reminder of what trust could be lost in an instant. Pedestrians moved around him, oblivious, and he envied their ignorance, their ability to live in a world that made sense. His phone buzzed a message from Lydia. Ethan froze, staring at the screen. "Can we talk tonight?" It was innocuous, almost mundane, but it carried the weight of a threat, a hidden agenda he could not decipher. He did not reply. Instead, he slipped the device into his pocket and continued walking, feeling the city's hum press against his nerves. In his mind, the narrative split into multiple possibilities. Was she truly planning harm, as her words implied, or was someone manipulating her? And if so, who? Derek, another unknown figure lurking in the shadows of their lives. The uncertainty gnawed at him, an invisible predator stalking his thoughts. By late afternoon, Ethan found himself at the small, nondescript library they had frequented together. He had always loved the quiet refuge among the books, the smell of paper and polished wood, the soft murmurs that seemed to whisper secrets only he and Lydia shared. Today, however, the silence felt suffocating. Every turn of the page, every shuffling of feet was a potential harbinger of revelation, each sound magnified in his ears. He wandered the aisles aimlessly, touching spines of novels he had once read, now meaningless. His mind replayed the telephone whisper in endless loops, searching for clues, for hidden context, for anything that would make sense of the absurdity that had invaded his life. Evening approached, the golden light spilling through the high windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the wooden floors. Ethan sat down at a corner table, opening his laptop, scanning news articles, online forums, anything that could explain the strange, foreboding tension that had taken residence in his chest. He found nothing concrete, only a series of coincidences that fed the paranoia building inside him. Each click, each line of text, seemed to validate both his fear and his love, a cruel paradox he could not untangle. Finally, as the library announced its closing, Ethan walked back into the cool night, the city lights flickering like distant, indifferent stars. The wind picked up, tugging at his coat and hair, and he realized he was shivering, not from cold, but from the raw, unfiltered anxiety coiling inside him. He had no answers, only fragments, only suspicion, only the echo of Lydia's voice. He understood, with a sick clarity, that nothing would ever feel the same. Trust had been fractured, innocence had been stolen, and a storm was gathering that he could neither see nor control. Back in the solitude of his apartment, Ethan poured a glass of whiskey, staring into its amber depths, hoping for a clarity that refused to come. Every sound, every flicker of light, every shadow seemed imbued with meaning. He could almost hear the whisper again, not through the phone, but in the spaces between heartbeats where fear and love intertwined. The day had passed in a blur of motion and thought. and yet the night promised a revelation far greater, far darker than he could imagine. And Ethan knew, though he did not yet understand how that his life, his marriage, and perhaps his very soul were about to be tested in ways he could never have anticipated. Ethan woke to the dull ache of tension that had settled deep into his chest overnight. The city outside his window moved in its indifferent rhythm, oblivious to the chaos that churned within him. For a moment, he clung to the thought that perhaps last night had been a nightmare, a cruel hallucination induced by exhaustion and stress. But the memory of Lydia's words, "Baby, it's almost done, then he'll be gone forever," was vivid, searing, refusing to be dismissed. He could feel the syllables vibrating against the walls of his skull, carrying a weight he could neither ignore nor decipher. Every instinct screamed that something was horribly, irreversibly wrong. The apartment felt colder than usual. Though the heater had been on all night, Ethan rubbed his arms, tracing invisible lines on his forearms, trying to soothe the prickling sensation of impending danger. He noticed the smallest things: Lydia's favorite mug still sitting in the sink, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the half-open drawer in her nightstand. Every detail became a potential clue. Every ordinary object transformed into a piece of a puzzle he could not yet solve. It was as if the world around him had shifted imperceptibly, each familiar corner hiding secrets he had never suspected. By mid-morning, Ethan found himself in the kitchen, brewing coffee mechanically, staring out at the gray cityscape. He watched pedestrians pass, umbrellas bobbing like synchronized dancers against the drizzle, and wondered if any of them sensed the storm that was quietly consuming his life. The rational part of his mind tried to insist that Lydia could not be capable of such cold, calculated malice. They had been together for nearly a decade. They had built a life, shared dreams, and weathered hardships. Yet, the words from her voice yesterday contradicted everything he had ever known about her. The dissonance made him dizzy, as though reality itself had fractured. He picked up her phone, left on the counter, hesitating for a long moment before unlocking it. The screen illuminated a series of messages he had never seen, some innocuous, some cryptic, all bearing the undertone of secrecy. A message from an unknown number caught his eye. "Are we ready for tonight? No mistakes." The text made his stomach drop. Tonight, no mistakes. Ethan's mind raced to Derek Hayes, the colleague she had mentioned in passing. Could this be connected? Or was there another layer to the deception he had not yet uncovered? He felt like a man lost in a labyrinth, each turn leading to shadows, each clue deepening the mystery rather than resolving it. The hours passed in a blur of observation and deduction. Ethan shadowed Lydia discreetly, watching from the distance as she moved with a confidence he had never seen before. She met someone in a quiet cafe downtown, their conversation punctuated by glances that suggested familiarity and trust. Ethan noted the time, the place, the rhythm of their movements, cataloging everything with a meticulousness born of fear. The more he observed, the more his heart ached, not for betrayal alone, but for the realization that he might never truly understand the woman he thought he knew. Returning home, Ethan found himself drawn to the apartment's living room, where a framed photograph of them together on a summer trip stared back at him. Lydia's smile, warm and radiant, seemed impossibly distant now. He touched the glass, feeling the cold surface beneath his fingertips, and imagined the ease with which she had once smiled at him, whispered promises of love and forever. That image, once a source of comfort, now mocked him with its unattainable innocence. He realized that love, no matter how deep, did not inoculate one against deception. Trust, fragile and sacred, could be dismantled in the span of a single whispered phrase. By afternoon, Ethan decided he could no longer remain passive. He needed answers. He needed to confront the possibility that Lydia was hiding something monumental, something that could destroy not only their marriage, but the lives intertwined with it. He began to piece together a plan, not confrontation. Not yet, but observation. Each step was deliberate, calculated, as though he were preparing for battle rather than a conversation. He checked their financial records, subtle discrepancies catching his eye, charges at places he did not recognize, unexplained withdrawals. Each anomaly was a thread, and Ethan knew that to pull at one was to unravel a tapestry whose full pattern he could not yet see. Evening approached, and Ethan found himself wandering through the city streets, a restless specter among the ordinary rhythms of life. Streetlights flickered in the light drizzle, casting distorted reflections on the wet pavement. He imagined Lydia walking beside him, her presence both comforting and now laden with uncertainty. The thought twisted painfully. How could someone so familiar be so impenetrable? He realized that part of him still wanted to trust her, to cling to the memory of her warmth, even as the evidence he had gathered whispered of something far darker. The conflict within him was visceral, a tug-of-war between hope and dread. In a desperate bid for clarity, he reached out to a private investigator, someone who could follow Lydia without revealing his own suspicions. As he spoke on the phone, providing details in a hushed, urgent voice, Ethan felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that someone else would see what he could not. Terror at the confirmation he might receive. Would the evidence vindicate his fear, or would it cast him further into uncertainty? He could not bear the thought of another day without understanding the truth, and yet he dreaded it with every fiber of his being. Back at the apartment that night, Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the darkened room. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, reflecting the turmoil inside him. He thought of Lydia again, the ease with which she had uttered those fatal words, the casual cruelty that had shattered his sense of reality. And yet, he felt a persistent pull, a reminder of why he had loved her in the first place. The warmth, the laughter, the moments of genuine connection that had built the foundation of their life together. He knew, deep down, that the path ahead would demand courage, clarity, and perhaps a confrontation with truths more painful than he could currently imagine. As midnight approached, Ethan's phone buzzed again, a message from the unknown number. He doesn't suspect a thing. Keep it that way. His pulse quickened, adrenaline mixing with fear. Every nerve in his body screamed that the game had changed. The stakes were higher, the danger more immediate than he had anticipated. He understood, with a chilling clarity, that this was no longer about suspicion or doubt. It was about survival, about unraveling a plot whose consequences could ripple far beyond himself. And for the first time, Ethan felt the sharp edge of determination cut through the fog of his fear. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive, the city shrouded in a persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into Ethan Calloway's very bones. He moved through his apartment with deliberate caution, every creak of the floorboards and distant honk of traffic outside amplified in his mind. Sleep had been an elusive refuge, haunted by fragments of last night's whispered threat. Lydia's words had set a spark that refused to die. "Baby, it's almost done. Then he'll be gone forever." Ethan could feel the syllables like cold steel pressing against his heart, a promise of danger that refused to clarify itself. He knew instinctively that there was more to Derek Hayes than casual acquaintance, more to Lydia than she had ever admitted. And yet, the specifics remained maddeningly out of reach, suspended in a fog of half-truths and shadowed intentions. By mid-morning, Ethan had begun the laborious task of retracing Lydia's steps over the past week. He checked her emails, her messages, scanned her social media accounts for interactions that might illuminate the mysterious he she had referenced. The anomalies were subtle but consistent canceled meetings that had no explanations, messages from unknown numbers arriving at odd hours, sudden changes in the tone of her communication. He could feel himself teetering on the edge of panic. Yet he also recognized that without methodical observation, he would remain trapped in this haze of uncertainty. Each detail was a thread in a tapestry of deception, and Ethan knew he had to trace the pattern before it unraveled everything he held dear. He remembered the half-whispered rumors at work, the casual glances exchanged by colleagues who seemed to share knowledge he did not possess. Derek Hayes had always appeared charming, unassuming even, a man whose charisma could disarm anyone, yet Ethan had always sensed something lurking beneath the surface, a subtle arrogance that now seemed sinister in retrospect. Every interaction Ethan observed now seemed fraught with hidden meaning, the smiles exchanged, the handshakes, the laughter. They were no longer innocent social gestures, but potential masks for schemes he had yet to uncover. And the thought that Lydia might be enmeshed in this, whether willingly or under duress, twisted his stomach into knots. By afternoon, Ethan resolved to confront the situation, cautiously but decisively. He decided to follow Lydia the way a detective shadows a suspect, maintaining distance, noting every move. Lydia had told him she was visiting the office to finish some paperwork, but the vague phrasing set off alarms in Ethan's mind. He parked his car a few blocks away, watching as she exited the apartment, her umbrella shielding her from the drizzle. She moved with purpose, yet there was a subtle hesitancy in her step, a careful awareness that made him wonder whether she sensed his scrutiny, or perhaps the scrutiny of someone else entirely. The cafe where Lydia arrived was tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner. A seemingly innocuous location, Ethan lingered across the street, observing from the shadows. Inside, Lydia greeted Derek with a smile that was warm, almost too practiced, her hands brushing against his, as if to convey familiarity. Ethan's heart constricted. The scene looked innocent on the surface, yet the tension he sensed in the air was palpable. The two exchanged papers and whispered words, gestures that spoke volumes to anyone trained to notice the subtleties of human behavior. Ethan scribbled notes in his notebook, trying to capture every detail, the tilt of her head, the way she avoided certain glances, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. It was a language of deception he did not yet fully understand, but one that gnawed at him with increasing urgency. Returning home, Ethan felt the weight of the morning pressing down. He reviewed the evidence in his mind, the inconsistencies that had begun to coalesce into a pattern. Derek Hayes was not the casual colleague he appeared to be, and Lydia's involvement, direct or indirect, was undeniable. The fear that had once been diffuse had now crystallized into a focused anxiety, a recognition that he was living within a labyrinth of intentions and motives that were not entirely his own. Each decision he had to make now carried consequences. Each step he took could reveal more than he wished to know. In the evening, Ethan received an anonymous email with an attachment. His hands trembled as he opened it. The file contained images of Lydia and Derek at multiple locations, some familiar, some unknown to him. In one photo, Lydia's expression was unreadable, lips pressed in a thin line, eyes glinting with determination. Derek, in another, held what looked like a briefcase, their posture and proximity suggesting a deal, an exchange. Ethan's pulse quickened. The clarity of the evidence was terrifying, but amid the fear was a gnawing doubt. Lydia's face in the images did not bear malice, nor did it express joy at the possible harm of another. There was a subtle complexity in her demeanor, a hint that she might be caught in circumstances beyond her control, playing a role she had not chosen. The night deepened as Ethan sat alone, the city lights casting fractured shadows across his apartment. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid reflecting the dim glow of the lamp beside him. He ran his fingers over the glass, feeling the cold seep through, grounding him in the present, reminding him that he had to act with clarity rather than emotion. He reviewed the photos repeatedly, analyzing each detail, attempting to parse truth from ambiguity. He realized, painfully, that the world was rarely as simple as black and white. Betrayal could be convoluted, motives multi-layered, and appearances treacherous. By midnight, exhaustion had settled into his bones, yet sleep was impossible. His mind raced with potential scenarios, plotting courses of action, considering confrontations and their possible outcomes. He knew he could no longer remain passive. The ambiguity of Lydia's behavior, The shadow of Derek's presence and the chilling implications of her whispered words demanded attention. Ethan understood that the truth, once revealed, would irrevocably change everything. Their relationship, their lives, perhaps even his sense of self. And so, he waited in tense anticipation for the next move, poised on the edge of discovery, aware that the coming hours might illuminate secrets that would either shatter him completely or offer the first glimmer of understanding. In the stillness of the night, Ethan's determination hardened. The unknown could no longer dominate him. He would follow the trail, uncover the motives, and confront the reality lurking behind Lydia's enigmatic whispers. Fear and doubt were constant companions, but so too was the flicker of hope that understanding, once grasped, could provide not only answers, but the possibility of redemption for both him and the woman he had loved for so long. Ethan had spent the better part of the morning trying to steady his racing thoughts, but each passing minute only deepened the gnawing sense that his life had become a tangle of half-truths and hidden motives. The images he had received, the cryptic messages, and Lydia's chilling words from the previous night coalesced into a web of questions with no clear answers. He knew he could no longer rely solely on intuition. He needed facts, observation, confirmation, and so, with a careful deliberation that belied his internal turmoil, he resolved to follow her, not in confrontation, but in quiet, invisible surveillance. He prepared methodically, ensuring he blended into the streets rather than drawing attention. Ethan had learned over the years that the ordinary often concealed the extraordinary, that the mundane rhythm of city life could mask the most sinister activities. He parked his car several blocks away from their apartment, donning a nondescript jacket and hat, and began the trek on foot. Each step was measured, deliberate, his eyes scanning for details he might have previously ignored. The flicker of shadows in alleyways, the subtle glances exchanged between strangers, the patterns of movement that spoke of intention. Lydia emerged, umbrella in hand, moving with a practiced ease that betrayed neither nervousness nor urgency. Ethan noticed the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked briefly toward the street corners, as if she suspected observation yet remained committed to her course. His heart thudded with each movement, a rhythm of anticipation and dread that made his pulse almost audible in his ears. They walked together briefly to the corner. Then she veered toward a small cafe tucked between a flower shop and a dry cleaner. Ethan followed at a distance, blending with pedestrians whose faces blurred under the gray light of the morning drizzle. Inside the cafe, Lydia greeted Derek Hayes with a smile that was both casual and purposeful, the kind of warmth that seemed rehearsed under scrutiny. Ethan ducked behind a pillar, taking in every gesture, every nuance. Derek leaned slightly forward, his tone low, voice smooth, conveying familiarity but also command. Lydia responded with subtle deference, nodding, adjusting her posture, all of which indicated a dynamic Ethan did not fully understand. Was this collusion, manipulation, or a negotiation neither had anticipated? Every movement spoke volumes, and Ethan's mind cataloged each detail, the brief hand touches, the exchange of documents, the unspoken acknowledgments, and the tension coiled beneath the surface. Hours passed in careful observation, Ethan's notebook filled with notes and sketches of movements, timings, and expressions. Each detail offered a fragment of insight, yet none answered the pressing question: what exactly did Lydia mean by "he'll be gone forever"? The possibilities were horrifying. Was she orchestrating harm? Was Derek a target or a partner? Was she protecting someone? Or manipulating Ethan himself? The ambiguity gnawed at him, each thought spiraling into another. Multiplying doubt and fear, he felt as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice, the depth below obscured by fog, unsure whether to leap, retreat, or wait. Returning home in the late afternoon, Ethan reviewed the footage he had discreetly captured with his phone. The images confirmed what he had seen: a relationship with complexity, but not yet malice. Lydia's expressions varied: moments of concern, determination, subtle frustration but never outright cruelty. Derek, on the other hand, projected confidence, an unsettling charm that could easily mask ulterior motives. Ethan felt a pang of frustration and confusion. Everything pointed toward some hidden agenda, but the nature of it remained elusive. He knew that assumptions could be fatal, yet indecision threatened to paralyze him. By evening, Ethan decided to confront the possibility that someone else might be manipulating the situation. If Lydia's intentions were not purely malevolent, then who or what was influencing the events unfolding around him? Derek seemed a likely candidate, yet even this assumption required proof. He began to analyze every known interaction, searching for patterns of control, coercion, or deception. The more he scrutinized, the more he realized the layers of complexity, relationships within relationships, motives hidden behind smiles and polite conversation, and secrets embedded in the ordinary cadence of daily life. Night fell, and Ethan returned to the apartment, the streets slick with rain, reflecting neon signs in distorted mosaics. The city's hum, once comforting in its constancy, now seemed ominous, a soundtrack to the unfolding drama. He poured himself a drink, letting the warmth seep through his fingers, grounding him momentarily. He reviewed the notes, each scribbled observation a potential clue, each scenario in his mind a hypothesis waiting to be tested. The fear was constant, yet beneath it stirred determination. He would uncover the truth. No matter how inconvenient, no matter how painful, he thought of the whispered words again. The casual malevolence that had pierced his trust. Ethan realized that he could no longer separate observation from emotion. The two were irrevocably intertwined. Each step toward understanding was also a step toward confronting the emotional betrayal he felt. The line between surveillance and obsession blurred, yet he pressed on. Knowing that clarity demanded vigilance, he could no longer allow himself to be passive, to wait for truth to reveal itself in idle expectation. The danger was present, immediate, and invisible, and it required a proactive mind to navigate. As the night deepened, Ethan plotted the next day meticulously. He would follow Lydia further, track Derek's interactions, and attempt to discern the hidden narrative shaping their lives. He also considered enlisting professional help, someone who could provide perspective and skill beyond his own. The path ahead was treacherous, uncertain, but unavoidable. Ethan understood, with a grim clarity, that the coming days would demand courage, intelligence, and an unflinching commitment to uncovering the truth. And as he finally set down his notebook and took a deep breath, he felt a cold resolve settle in his chest. He would not be passive in the face of uncertainty. Not when so much hung in the balance. The apartment was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint patter of rain against the window. Ethan sat in the dim light, glass of whiskey in hand, eyes fixed on the shadows that danced across the walls. Somewhere in the city, Lydia moved with purpose. Derek maneuvered with intent, and Ethan knew that every decision he made now would influence outcomes beyond his control. But he also knew that inaction was no longer an option. Trust, deception, and danger had become intertwined in ways he had never imagined, and the first step to untangling them was vigilance. With that determination burning in his chest, Ethan prepared himself for the next day, aware that each moment brought new revelations, new risks, and a closer confrontation with truths he had long feared to acknowledge. The whisper from the night before had ignited a chain of events he could not stop, but he could navigate them, and perhaps, just perhaps, to emerge with answers that would redefine everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and betrayal. The following morning, Ethan awoke to a persistent drizzle tapping against the window pane, the rhythm eerily matching the rapid pulse in his chest. Sleep had not brought relief. Instead, it had left him with fragmented memories of Lydia's voice echoing in the dark corners of his mind. "Baby, it's almost done. Then he'll be gone forever." Those words had lodged themselves like splinters, impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss. The subtle menace in her tone, The casual precision with which she spoke suggested intention, but intention for what? Ethan struggled to piece together the scattered clues that had accumulated over the past days, and yet the picture remained maddeningly incomplete. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan spent the morning poring over the files he had collected: photographs, emails, messages, and his own notes of Lydia and Derek's interactions. Each item revealed small inconsistencies, little moments that didn't add up: a half smile here, a fleeting look there, gestures that might mean nothing or everything. Ethan had always trusted the evidence of his own eyes, but now each observation seemed layered, obscured by motives he could not fully grasp. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that Lydia's world was not as simple as it appeared. Something deeper, more sinister, was at play, and he was merely skimming the surface. By midday, he decided he needed to observe them more directly, to witness the interactions firsthand, rather than rely solely on images and messages. Ethan arranged a casual lunch meeting in a park near the cafe Lydia frequented. He sat on a bench under a canopy of wet leaves, maintaining enough distance to remain unnoticed, yet close enough to catch subtle expressions and movements. Lydia arrived, her umbrella casting a soft shadow across her face, and Derek followed shortly after, carrying a folder of documents. The ease of their interaction struck. Ethan's smiles exchanged, hands briefly brushing, a nod of understanding that seemed almost conspiratorial. As he watched, Ethan noted small, telling details: Derek's meticulous gestures, the way he leaned forward slightly to ensure privacy, Lydia's careful responses, the measured tones in her conversation. She spoke in whispers, yet her voice carried authority, decisiveness. Ethan's stomach churned. There was an undeniable power dynamic, but he could not discern who held the upper hand. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken intentions. The air between them charged with a tension that Ethan could feel pressing against his chest. Every step, every glance, every subtle movement felt like a deliberate piece in a larger, unknown game. He realized he needed context, something beyond mere observation. To understand what he was witnessing, Ethan began mentally reconstructing previous events: the canceled meetings, the strange messages, the late-night whispers, and the subtle changes in Lydia's demeanor. Patterns began to emerge, threads connecting disparate moments into a tapestry of hidden communication. Derek was not merely a casual acquaintance. He was involved in something calculated, deliberate, and Lydia, despite her enigmatic presence, appeared to be navigating a treacherous path, one that could easily be misinterpreted by an outsider like him. The revelation was both alarming and illuminating. There was strategy at play, but it was unclear whose side the strategy served. By late afternoon, Ethan knew he could no longer act solely on suspicion. He needed evidence that was concrete, irrefutable, something that would clarify Lydia's role and reveal Derek's true intentions. He returned home, reviewing the photos and notes he had compiled, cross-referencing every detail, every interaction, every cryptic message. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming, yet necessary. Ethan felt as if he were standing on the edge of an abyss, peering into a darkness that promised either revelation or destruction. Each detail added a piece to the puzzle, yet each piece also raised new questions, creating a labyrinth of uncertainty that challenged his every instinct. Evening arrived, and Ethan prepared for another night of surveillance. He equipped himself with a small camera, a notebook, and a discreet audio recorder, tools to capture evidence that could not be interpreted through memory alone. The streets were slick from the ongoing rain, reflections of neon lights fractured across the pavement, casting the city in an otherworldly glow. Ethan moved with deliberate caution, blending with late-night pedestrians, observing Lydia as she navigated her evening errands. Each stop, each interaction, each brief encounter became a potential clue, a piece of the puzzle that might finally illuminate her intentions. The first stop was a small boutique where Lydia met Derek again, exchanging documents and brief smiles. Ethan observed from a distance, noting how carefully Lydia maintained her composure, her eyes alert and calculating, scanning the room and the street outside. Derek, for his part, exhibited a casual charm, an air of control that belied the uncertainty. Ethan sensed the scene was meticulous, choreographed almost like a performance, every gesture deliberate, yet the underlying purpose remained obscured. Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. Was this a calculated plan to harm someone, a defensive maneuver to protect herself, or something more intricate that he could not yet comprehend? Hours passed. The city quieted, leaving only the soft patter of rain and the distant hum of traffic. Ethan returned home, exhausted yet unsatisfied, aware that he had witnessed only a fragment of a larger narrative. He reviewed the day's observations, cross-referencing notes with photos and prior messages. Slowly, a tentative theory began to form. Lydia might not be the architect of harm. Perhaps she was ensnared, maneuvering within constraints imposed by Derek or another unknown force. The possibility both relieved and alarmed him. Relief came from the notion that Lydia might still be innocent. Alarm came from the realization that the danger was far greater than he had imagined, and that understanding the truth would require more than passive observation. Late into the night, Ethan sat in his apartment, sipping whiskey, staring at the shadows cast across the walls by the flickering streetlights outside. The rain continued, rhythmic and insistent, a reminder of the unrelenting pressure building in his life. He knew that the next steps were crucial. One miscalculation, one assumption, one overlooked detail could shatter not only his understanding, but the fragile fabric of trust that remained between him and Lydia. The whispered words from that fateful night had initiated a chain reaction, and now he stood at the center of it, navigating a maze of deception, fear, and uncertainty. Ethan's resolve hardened. He would continue to follow, to observe, to collect the evidence needed to reveal the true story behind Lydia and Derek. He understood that the path ahead was fraught with peril, that clarity could bring both relief and devastation. Yet, despite the fear and uncertainty, a quiet determination surged within him. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost, and finally confront the reality hidden behind the shadows of whispered intentions. Ethan sat in the dim glow of his living room, the city outside, muted by a relentless drizzle that mirrored the turmoil inside him. Every shadow seemed to harbor secrets, every creak of the apartment floor a potential revelation. Sleep had eluded him again, leaving only the persistent echo of Lydia's whispered words. "Baby, it's almost done. Then he'll be gone forever." The phrase had become a mantra in his mind, a sinister rhythm that underscored every thought. It was impossible to parse, impossible to ignore, yet impossible to fully grasp. Ethan realized that before he could confront anyone, Lydia, Derek, or even himself, he had to confront the raw tangle of emotions churning inside. Fear, betrayal, confusion, and lingering love competed for dominance, a battle as exhausting as any he had ever faced. His mind replayed the moments leading up to this nightmare, the small signs he had once dismissed, the late-night phone calls, the subtle tension in Lydia's voice. The fleeting glances exchanged with Derek now stood out in stark relief. He remembered the quiet Sunday morning when Lydia had slipped out for an errand, returning with a calmness that now seemed rehearsed, her eyes betraying a guarded intensity he had failed to notice. Ethan's chest tightened at the memory. He had trusted her implicitly, blind to the subtle dance of secrets playing out before him. The realization that he had been oblivious for so long was almost more painful than the potential betrayal itself. By mid-morning, Ethan decided he needed to step back and examine his own perceptions. He retreated to the small study he had once used for writing and research, clearing the desk of clutter until only a notebook, his laptop, and a steaming cup of coffee remained. He began to document everything he knew, every observation, every interaction, every fragment of conversation that could shed light on Lydia's behavior. The process was painstaking, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths. He could not separate emotion from observation, and his love for Lydia might be coloring his interpretation of events. Yet, he persisted, understanding that only a systematic approach could illuminate the murky reality. Hours passed as he analyzed patterns, comparing timestamps of messages with images, locations, and prior knowledge of Lydia's schedule. Ethan discovered subtle consistencies. Derek's appearances always coincided with moments Lydia claimed to be alone. Certain phrases repeated in messages that seemed innocuous, yet carried underlying tension. Each discovery added layers of complexity, suggesting a network of motives that extended beyond what Ethan had initially suspected. The realization was terrifying. If these interactions were part of a deliberate plan, the scope of deception could be far greater than he had imagined. By afternoon, Ethan resolved that passive observation was no longer sufficient. He needed to engage directly, albeit carefully, to gain insight into Lydia's intentions. He rehearsed questions, phrasing them in a manner that would elicit truth without confrontation. In his mind, he replayed scenarios, casual inquiries that might reveal inconsistencies, neutral topics to gauge her reactions, subtle provocations to observe emotional responses. Each strategy carried risks, yet inaction felt far more perilous. Ethan understood that clarity demanded courage, and courage meant facing both potential betrayal and the emotional consequences of that confrontation. When Lydia returned home later that evening, Ethan waited in the living room, the soft hum of the heater filling the silence. She entered, umbrella dripping water onto the floor, eyes alert yet composed. Ethan studied her carefully, noting the fluidity of her movements, the way she adjusted her coat, the brief exhale as she set her bag down. He felt a pang of longing, remembering the ease and warmth of her presence before suspicion had infected their interactions. He resisted the urge to reach for her, to demand answers in the heat of emotion, knowing that restraint was essential. Instead, Ethan spoke in a calm, measured tone, initiating a conversation that began innocuously, touching on mundane aspects of their day. He observed Lydia's responses, searching for cracks in her demeanor, inconsistencies in her stories, or subtle clues that might reveal hidden motives. Her voice remained steady, her expressions controlled, yet Ethan detected micro-expressions, a brief tightening of the jaw, a flicker in her eyes, a hesitation in speech. Each subtle signal sent a jolt through him, simultaneously reassuring and alarming, suggesting that while she was composed, the truth remained guarded. Over the course of the evening, Ethan's internal conflict intensified. He wanted to trust her, to believe that the mysterious interactions with Derek were benign or protective in nature. Yet the memory of her whispered words, the enigmatic phrase that had shattered his sense of security, remained a persistent shadow. Ethan realized that he was navigating a delicate balance, seeking truth without collapsing under fear, observing without judgment, questioning without accusation. The emotional and psychological stakes were immense, and each decision had consequences that extended beyond immediate clarity. As night fell, Ethan reflected on the complexity of trust and perception. He understood that relationships were rarely binary, that loyalty and deception could coexist in ways that defied simple categorization. Lydia's actions could be motivated by fear, strategy, or necessity, and Derek's involvement could range from manipulative to opportunistic. The challenge lay in disentangling intention from appearance, motive from perception, and truth from the web of ambiguity that surrounded them. Ethan felt the weight of responsibility pressing against his chest, knowing that a single misstep could lead to misunderstanding, heartbreak, or worse. Finally, in the quiet hours, Ethan committed to a plan. He would continue to observe, document, and analyze, preparing himself for the inevitable confrontation that would bring clarity. He recognized that patience, vigilance, and emotional discipline were crucial. The answers he sought would not be revealed through haste or impulse. As he sat in the dim light of the study, pen in hand, notebook open, he felt a sense of purpose coalesce amidst the chaos. The path ahead was fraught with uncertainty, yet he was determined to navigate it with both resolve and care, driven by the need to uncover the truth and protect the fragile bonds of trust that remained. By the time the city had fallen silent under the blanket of night, Ethan's mind was sharp, his senses alert, his heart wary but resolute. The puzzle was intricate, the players complex, but he would see it through. Lydia's whispered words, once a source of terror, had become a catalyst for awareness, compelling him to confront both the external mysteries and the internal turbulence that had defined these past days. The journey was only beginning, and Ethan understood that the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, higher than love, higher than fear, higher than trust itself. Ethan had reached a point where waiting passively no longer sufficed. The web of uncertainty surrounding Lydia and Derek had tightened like a noose, and he could feel the pulse of danger in every shadow, every sound. That evening, he resolved to follow Lydia directly, to witness her interactions firsthand, and gain the clarity that observation alone might provide. He equipped himself with a small camera tucked under his jacket, a notebook, and a keen eye for detail, aware that every movement, every glance, could carry hidden significance. The rain had returned, drizzling softly over the city streets, casting distorted reflections of neon signs on slick pavement and lending the evening an almost cinematic quality, both beautiful and foreboding. He trailed Lydia at a discreet distance as she left the apartment building, her umbrella swaying slightly in the damp wind. She moved with an air of purposeful calm, yet Ethan noticed subtle tensions, a tightening around the shoulders, a flicker in her eyes as she glanced at street corners, a hesitation in her step that suggested awareness of unseen watchers. Derek was waiting, as expected, at a small, inconspicuous cafe tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat. Ethan ducked behind a lamppost, using the shadows to mask his presence, and began to catalog every detail of their interaction. He watched as Lydia approached Derek, her expression neutral, lips pressed into a line that conveyed focus and determination. Derek greeted her with a casual charm, his posture relaxed but precise, betraying a calculated confidence. Inside the cafe, the air was tense, yet outwardly mundane. Ethan could see them exchange documents, Derek leaning forward slightly to ensure privacy, while Lydia adjusted her seating to maintain composure. Her hands were steady, yet Ethan noticed subtle micro-expressions, a brief tightening of her jaw, the faint furrowing of brows, a flicker of impatience in her eyes. Derek's demeanor suggested control, authority, and an almost imperceptible arrogance. The kind of man who assumed leverage even when unseen. Ethan's pulse quickened. The scene, seemingly ordinary, was laden with significance, each gesture and word a potential thread in a complex narrative he was desperate to unravel. As the conversation continued, Ethan's mind raced to interpret each clue. The documents exchanged hinted at a transaction or agreement, yet the purpose remained obscured. Lydia's expressions, a mixture of resolve and caution, suggested involvement under constraints or duress. Could she be complicit willingly? Or was she maneuvering within a situation forced upon her? The ambiguity tormented him. Every instinct screamed to confront her, to demand answers. Yet he understood that impulsive action could unravel not only his chance for truth, but the delicate balance of the scenario unfolding before him. Hours passed in careful observation. Ethan scribbled notes feverishly, capturing times, gestures, and phrases, constructing a timeline of events that might reveal the hidden pattern. He traced the subtle cues, a glance toward the door, as if anticipating someone's arrival, a shift in seating to block view, the tone of voice when discussing the documents, all hints of a narrative just beyond reach. Derek's confidence seemed almost performative, designed to conceal vulnerabilities and exert subtle influence. Lydia's poise was equally intentional, each motion measured to convey control, while masking the possibility of manipulation. Ethan felt as though he were witnessing a delicate dance, intricate and precise, yet the music guiding it remained unheard. By late afternoon, Ethan's observations had begun to form tentative conclusions. Derek's involvement suggested a scheme with stakes higher than casual work interactions. Lydia's behavior, while enigmatic, hinted at strategic engagement rather than malice. Perhaps she was protecting herself, or someone else, from consequences Ethan could not yet fathom. The revelation was simultaneously relieving and alarming. The woman he loved might not be the architect of harm, yet the forces surrounding her were unquestionably dangerous. The implications were profound. He had to navigate the situation with precision, avoiding assumptions that could jeopardize both understanding and safety. Ethan followed them as they left the cafe, noting the route and the pace of movement. The city streets were quieter now. The earlier rain reduced to a mist, reflections on wet asphalt creating an otherworldly, fractured landscape. He maintained a careful distance, aware that any misstep could expose his surveillance. The interplay between caution and urgency created a tension in his chest, a constant reminder that the truth was both tantalizingly close and frustratingly out of reach. He realized that understanding the dynamics of this encounter was crucial not only to discern Lydia's intentions, but to anticipate the potential consequences of Derek's influence. Back at his apartment that evening, Ethan reviewed the footage and his notes meticulously. Every gesture, every micro-expression, every exchange of documents was analyzed, cross-referenced with prior observations. Patterns began to emerge. Derek's dominance in the interactions, Lydia's subtle countermeasures, the timing of each move. Ethan felt a mixture of dread and hope. The dread of the danger that lurked in these encounters, the hope that, by understanding them, he could intervene appropriately and perhaps protect Lydia from the consequences she might face. As night settled over the city, Ethan remained vigilant. He knew that the coming days would demand more than observation. They would require courage, strategy, and a willingness to confront truths he had long feared. The whispered words from Lydia, once a source of terror, had now transformed into a catalyst for awareness and action. Ethan understood that clarity could only be achieved through careful study, patience, and the readiness to act when the time was right. The city was quiet now, but the tension persisted, coiling in his chest like a living thing. Reminding him that the story was far from over, Ethan finally allowed himself a moment of rest, leaning back in his chair and staring at the ceiling. Shadows danced across the walls as the streetlights flickered outside, casting distorted reflections into his apartment. Each movement in the darkness seemed imbued with significance, each sound a potential revelation. He knew that Lydia's intentions, Derek's schemes, and the path of events yet to unfold would demand his full attention and resolve. There was no turning back. The pieces were in motion, and Ethan had no choice but to follow them to their inevitable convergence, prepared to face whatever truths they revealed. The night deepened, and Ethan sat in the dim light, a quiet determination settling over him. He understood that observation alone was insufficient. He would need insight, strategy, and courage. Yet in this moment, with the city sleeping beneath the rain, he felt the first flicker of control returning. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but Ethan Calloway was no longer a passive witness. He would follow the trail, decipher the intentions, and confront the reality that had been hidden behind shadows and whispered words. The journey was only beginning, and he knew that the stakes could not be higher. Ethan had never felt so disoriented in his own life. The city outside his window glimmered under the intermittent drizzle, neon lights reflecting off wet asphalt like fractured memories. He sat hunched over his notebook, reviewing every observation he had recorded in the past days. The details of Lydia and Derek's encounters repeated in his mind, their gestures, the whispered words, the subtle exchanges of documents. Yet something still didn't add up. Every piece of evidence he had collected suggested complexity, but now he noticed inconsistencies that had escaped him before. Derek's demeanor, so confident and controlled, occasionally slipped into subtle cues of unease, and Lydia, her expressions, while composed, occasionally betrayed hesitation or distress. It was a fleeting moment each time, but it was enough to make Ethan pause. For hours, He replayed the images and messages, the fragments of conversation, trying to decipher what they meant. Then, almost by accident, he noticed it, a timestamp, a slight discrepancy between a message sent and a meeting recorded in the cafe. Derek had arrived early, while Lydia had arrived precisely on time. The timing suggested coordination, not coincidence, but the unevenness hinted at manipulation. Ethan's pulse quickened as a new possibility began to form. Perhaps Lydia was not the villain in this narrative at all. Perhaps she was navigating a dangerous situation, one in which Derek held the true power, his stomach twisted in both relief and fear. Relief that the woman he loved might not be orchestrating harm, and fear at the realization that the danger was far greater than he had imagined. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Ethan decided to confront the unknown directly. He spent the remainder of the day piecing together a plan, considering ways to observe both Lydia and Derek more closely, to anticipate the moves that had previously eluded him. Each step required careful calculation. One wrong move could reveal his surveillance or put him in danger. Yet the urgency was undeniable. If Derek was manipulating events behind the scenes, Ethan needed to understand the extent of his control, the risks involved, and most importantly, whether Lydia was acting under duress or in her own agency. As dusk settled, Ethan made his way to a location he had discovered through careful observation, a quiet residential area where Lydia and Derek had met repeatedly. He parked several blocks away, shadows and reflections concealing him from casual observation. The air was thick with anticipation, and every sound, the rustling of leaves, distant footsteps, the faint hum of traffic, seemed amplified in the tension of the moment. He watched as Lydia approached the meeting point, Derek already there, leaning casually against a parked car. Their conversation began with polite greetings, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. Derek's posture was relaxed, but his eyes scanned the street and surroundings, a predator in plain sight. Lydia's composure was precise, each motion calculated, each glance guarded. Ethan's mind raced to interpret what he saw. Derek's body language suggested dominance, control over the narrative, while Lydia appeared cautious yet determined. It became clear to Ethan that Derek was orchestrating more than casual business. He was manipulating circumstances, controlling not only interactions but potentially outcomes. Lydia's participation, while active, did not exude malice. Instead, it suggested strategy, defense, and perhaps a desire to mitigate harm. The revelation was both a relief and a terror. The woman he loved was enmeshed in something dangerous, and Derek's influence extended beyond what Ethan had initially imagined. Hours passed as he continued to observe, recording gestures, movements, and snippets of conversation. Ethan's analytical mind pieced together the patterns. Derek arrived at precisely timed intervals, exchanging documents or brief verbal cues. Lydia followed a predictable path, yet she adjusted subtly to each new development, indicating awareness and responsiveness. The interplay between them was intricate, a game of power and influence that required precision to navigate. Ethan felt a mixture of admiration and dread. Lydia's resilience was evident, yet the stakes were higher than he had realized, and the potential for miscalculation, for disaster, loomed large. As night fell, Ethan returned home, exhausted but resolute. He reviewed the footage, noting moments he had initially missed, a subtle shake of Derek's hand, a faint glance exchanged with a passerby, Lydia's brief exhale, as though containing her stress. Each detail reinforced the theory that Derek was the true manipulator, using charm, timing, and intimidation to maintain control. Lydia's actions, while enigmatic, seemed to be reactive, strategic, and protective rather than malicious. Ethan's understanding shifted, a new perspective forming amidst the fog of confusion. The danger was real, but the villainy lay elsewhere. Later that night, Ethan sat in the dim light of his apartment, glass of whiskey in hand, reflecting on the day's revelations. The tension that had haunted him was now mixed with clarity. Derek Hayes, the man he had suspected casually, was orchestrating a scenario that placed Lydia and perhaps others at risk. Lydia's whispered words, once perceived as a threat to another, might have been a reflection of her own anxiety, a coded cry for help, or an acknowledgement of the peril surrounding her. Ethan realized that his assumptions had almost blinded him to the truth, and that careful observation, patience, and analytical reasoning were essential to navigating the unfolding drama. He felt a mixture of relief, anger, and renewed determination. Relief that Lydia might not be malicious, anger at the manipulations that had ensnared them both, and determination to act decisively when the moment demanded it. The city outside remained quiet, the rain reduced to a fine mist. Reflecting streetlights in shimmering patterns on the asphalt, Ethan knew that the path ahead required vigilance, strategy, and courage. Derek's true nature had been revealed in fragments, and it was only a matter of time before the larger scheme became clear. By the early hours of the morning, Ethan's resolve had solidified. He understood that the next steps were critical. He would need to confront the manipulations, protect Lydia if necessary, and navigate a confrontation with the architect of this scheme. The whispered words from Lydia's phone call had set a series of events into motion. But now Ethan had the first real understanding of the forces at play. The stakes were higher, the danger more imminent, and the need for clarity more urgent than ever. As he prepared for the coming days, he felt a sharpened focus, a readiness to face the unfolding drama, and an unwavering commitment to uncover the truth hidden behind shadows, whispers, and deception. Ethan spent the following morning methodically reviewing his notes and footage, trying to identify the moments that might reveal Lydia's true intentions. The images, videos, and messages he had collected formed a patchwork of interactions, seemingly ordinary but laden with subtle nuances that only careful observation could reveal. Derek Hayes's presence was unmistakably dominant. His movements, gestures, and timing exuded control. Yet Lydia's responses, though measured and precise, contained micro-expressions that suggested awareness, caution, and strategic thinking. Ethan realized that the narrative he had assumed was simple, binary even, was far more complex. Lydia was not merely participating. She was navigating a dangerous game with skill, perhaps even under coercion. By midday, Ethan decided that observation alone was insufficient. If he was to understand the true dynamics at play, he needed to engage strategically, not directly confrontationally. He began to map out Lydia and Derek's routines, noting patterns, timing, and sequences. He planned to create situations that would elicit truthful reactions without alerting them to his intentions. It was a delicate balance. Too much interference could collapse the situation. Too little, and the opportunity for clarity would slip away. The thought weighed heavily on him, but he recognized that action was necessary. The whispers from Lydia's phone call were no longer just a source of fear. They were a catalyst, demanding measured response. In the afternoon, Ethan followed Lydia as she left for a meeting downtown. He maintained a careful distance, blending with the pedestrians and street traffic, his senses alert for anything that might hint at the true stakes of her encounter. Derek arrived soon after, his presence as composed and confident as ever. The two moved into a narrow alleyway, ostensibly to avoid the public eye, and Ethan crouched behind a parked car, straining to observe. What he saw was not overtly sinister documents exchanged, quiet discussion, but the precision and coordination of their actions suggested careful orchestration. Ethan's mind raced. Was Lydia acting under Derek's coercion, or was she maneuvering to protect someone from harm? The meeting continued for an hour. With Ethan documenting every gesture, word, and pause, he noted Derek's subtle dominance, the way he leaned slightly forward, positioning himself as the authority, the calculated way he observed Lydia's reactions, the micro-adjustments in his posture, signaling control. Lydia, in contrast, maintained composure, her expressions carefully modulated, her body language signaling alertness and strategic intent. Ethan's pulse raced as he realized the stakes involved. This was no casual interaction, no routine work meeting. There was manipulation, there was strategy, and potentially, there was danger. Returning home in the evening, Ethan reviewed the footage. Cross-referencing every detail with prior observations, he discovered subtle consistencies. Derek always positioned himself to control access. Lydia consistently navigated these constraints with precision, and certain gestures once overlooked revealed attempts to deflect or mitigate potential threats. Ethan felt a growing respect for Lydia's acumen, recognizing that she was neither passive nor naive. Yet the threat of Derek's influence remained undeniable, and Ethan understood that intervention would need to be precise, calculated, and timely. Any misstep could trigger consequences he was not prepared to manage. As night fell, Ethan reflected on the psychological complexity of the situation. He had assumed betrayal, yet the emerging picture suggested manipulation rather than malevolence. Lydia's whispered words, once a source of fear, now seemed layered with nuance, an acknowledgement of peril, perhaps a coded signal of her struggle. Ethan realized that understanding intention required patience, observation, and empathy. He could no longer rely solely on assumptions or suspicion. He had to navigate a delicate balance of vigilance and trust, a challenge that tested both his intellect and his heart. The city outside his apartment was quiet, rain glistening on streets and sidewalks, reflecting scattered neon lights. Ethan sat at his desk, reviewing notes and replaying images, constructing a map of interactions and potential motivations. He considered the implications of each piece of evidence, weighing possible outcomes against ethical and emotional consequences. Derek's manipulations were evident, but Lydia's responses suggested resilience and strategy. Ethan's mind alternated between fear and hope, fear of the consequences of inaction, hope that Lydia's intentions were protective rather than harmful. In the quiet of the night, Ethan resolved to act, but with caution. He would gather more evidence, observe more closely, and prepare to support Lydia if necessary. He understood that timing, precision, and awareness were essential. The whispered words from Lydia's phone call had initiated a sequence of events, but now Ethan had a clearer understanding of the underlying dynamics. Derek was the orchestrator of control. Lydia was maneuvering within constraints, and he, Ethan, needed to ensure that both truth and safety were preserved. Hours later, as the city settled under a muted glow, Ethan made final preparations for the coming days. He organized his notes, set up discreet tracking of Lydia's movements, and developed contingency plans for potential confrontations. Every detail, from timing to gestures to unspoken cues, was accounted for. Ethan's resolve strengthened with each passing hour. He understood that the path ahead would demand courage, intelligence, and careful observation. The risk was high, but the alternative, remaining passive in the face of uncertainty and potential danger, was unacceptable. Finally, Ethan allowed himself a brief pause. Sitting in the dim light of his apartment, glass of whiskey in hand, he reflected on the lessons learned. Appearances were deceptive, trust could be tested in unimaginable ways, and understanding required both patience and courage. Lydia's whispered words, once a source of terror, had become a call to action, compelling him to navigate a labyrinth of motives, dangers, and truths. He understood that the coming days would define not only the outcome of their immediate crisis, but also the resilience and depth of their connection. With that determination, Ethan prepared for the next stage of observation and intervention. The stakes were higher than ever, but he was no longer paralyzed by fear or suspicion. He had begun to unravel the patterns, identify the players, and understand the hidden dynamics. The journey was only beginning, yet for the first time in days, Ethan felt a sense of control, a readiness to face the unfolding drama, and a commitment to uncover the truth that would ultimately define the fate of both Lydia and himself. The night air was thick with tension as Ethan navigated the slick streets, every reflection in the puddles amplifying his sense of unease. The previous days of observation had left him exhausted, but there was no rest, only the pressing urgency to act. He had pieced together enough patterns to predict Lydia and Derek's movements, yet the situation remained perilously unpredictable. Derek's presence was increasingly menacing, his control over the encounters more calculated, while Lydia's responses hinted at both strategy and hidden stress. Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. Miscalculation could endanger them both, and any direct confrontation now required precision, timing, and composure beyond mere courage. Earlier that day, he had reviewed the series of meetings Lydia and Derek had conducted, cross-referencing timestamps with observed locations. Derek's control was methodical. Each action was measured, designed to conceal intentions while asserting dominance. Ethan could see it in the small gestures, the way Derek positioned himself to block exits, the subtle way he monitored Lydia's reactions, the precise timing of his phone calls. Lydia, however, displayed a quiet resilience. Each step, glance, and adjustment in posture suggested tactical awareness. A careful navigation of the constraints imposed upon her. Ethan felt a mixture of fear and admiration. She was far more capable than he had given her credit for. Yet the danger surrounding her was real and immediate. By evening, Ethan had decided that he could no longer simply observe. He needed to intervene to ensure Lydia's safety, to be ready should Derek escalate the situation. He equipped himself with a small set of tools, a discreet camera, a GPS tracker, and a notebook for rapid notes, as well as the mental preparation for any sudden confrontations. He positioned himself strategically near the location where Lydia and Derek were scheduled to meet, blending with the crowd, aware of every sound and movement. The rain fell in a persistent drizzle, the damp streets reflecting neon lights in fractured patterns, adding a surreal, cinematic quality to the tense evening. Ethan's patience was rewarded within minutes. Lydia appeared, umbrella shielding her from the drizzle, moving with a controlled yet cautious gait. Derek followed shortly, his movements confident, deliberate, every step calculated. Ethan noted how Derek assumed a position that dominated the physical space, subtly controlling access and attention, while Lydia adjusted her posture to maintain both presence and discretion. Their interaction was quiet, almost mundane on the surface. Yet Ethan's trained eye captured the underlying tension, the micro-expressions, and the subtle shifts in body language that revealed the dynamics at play. As the evening progressed, Derek's intentions became clearer. He began to issue instructions, his tone low but authoritative, guiding Lydia through a series of tasks that seemed harmless at first glance but carried hidden implications. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized that Derek was manipulating events to a degree that Lydia could not fully control, and the risk of escalation was imminent. Lydia's responses were calm but measured, each word and gesture carefully designed to navigate the perilous situation. Ethan recognized the stakes. Any misstep, any misinterpretation could result in immediate danger, and he needed to be prepared for intervention. At one point, Derek's focus shifted, and Ethan saw the opportunity for direct action. He moved closer, positioning himself to be within earshot and able to respond if the situation escalated. Lydia glanced briefly toward him, a fleeting flicker of recognition or perhaps relief. Before returning her attention to Derek, Ethan's pulse raced. The tension was palpable, the stakes higher than ever. Derek, sensing no immediate threat, continued his manipulations, unaware of the vigilant presence nearby. Ethan had to maintain calm, blending observation with readiness, prepared to act decisively the moment the danger crossed a critical threshold. Suddenly, Derek's demeanor shifted, an aggressive posture emerging as he gestured toward Lydia with forceful emphasis. Ethan's instincts screamed danger. This was the first overt display of coercion. Lydia's composure remained, yet her micro-expressions betrayed a fleeting fear and calculation. Ethan stepped closer, ensuring he remained hidden but within a range that allowed rapid intervention. The alleyway was narrow, shadows stretching across the walls, rain dripping from rooftops, creating a tense, cinematic tableau. Derek's arrogance and confidence now bore the unmistakable weight of potential violence. Ethan's mind raced as he prepared for immediate action. He considered every possible response: distraction, confrontation, protective intervention. The situation was fluid, the variables numerous. Yet amid the fear and adrenaline, a clarity emerged. His role was to protect, to observe strategically, and to intervene only when necessary to ensure Lydia's safety. He could no longer act on assumption. Precision and timing were critical. The whispered words from Lydia's phone call, once chilling in their ambiguity, now took on new significance. They were a signal, a harbinger of imminent danger, and a reminder that Ethan's vigilance could mean the difference between safety and disaster. The confrontation, when it came, was sudden and intense. Derek advanced toward Lydia, his voice rising in command, his posture menacing. Ethan's body tensed. Ready to act, he stepped from the shadows, voice firm but controlled, demanding Derek cease and back away. The sudden intrusion startled Derek, his confidence momentarily shaken, creating a critical window. Lydia, seizing the moment, adjusted her position, subtly asserting her own presence while remaining composed. The tension was electric, the rain adding a rhythmic, almost cinematic intensity to the scene. Minutes stretched, each movement deliberate, until Derek's bluff began to falter. Ethan and Lydia, acting in silent coordination, managed to regain spatial and psychological control. Derek, realizing his dominance was challenged, retreated, his posture still confident, but now tinged with unease. Ethan exhaled, relief mingling with adrenaline, as he and Lydia navigated the immediate danger. Yet the encounter left a lingering awareness. The threat was not gone, merely postponed, and the game of strategy, manipulation, and survival would continue. Returning home later, Ethan felt the weight of the night settle in his chest. The adrenaline faded, leaving a profound exhaustion and a tempered awareness of the stakes they faced. He reviewed every detail in his mind, recognizing Lydia's resilience, Derek's manipulations, and the need for continued vigilance. Trust, observation, and precise action had preserved safety for the moment, but Ethan knew the narrative was far from resolved. The coming days would demand the same careful calculation, courage, and awareness. As the hidden layers of intention gradually revealed themselves in the complex interplay between Lydia, Derek, and the fragile truth Ethan sought to uncover. The tension in the apartment was palpable that night. Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, mind racing with the events that had just unfolded. Derek's aggression had been an unmistakable escalation, and yet the relief he felt from Lydia's composure and their coordinated response was tempered by the knowledge that this confrontation was only a fragment of a much larger game. He understood now more than ever that the true challenge lay not in isolated encounters, but in the ongoing, complex interplay of manipulation, strategy, and hidden motives. Every movement, every decision would have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Lydia entered the room quietly, her expression composed, but her eyes revealing the exhaustion that had been masked throughout the evening. Ethan noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she set down her bag, the subtle tightness around her jaw, and the fleeting shadow of tension in her gaze. These were signs he had learned to interpret, indicators of stress, of calculated effort, of a woman navigating perilous circumstances with courage and precision. He rose, moving toward her with measured steps, careful not to startle her, aware that every gesture in this delicate dynamic carried weight. They sat together in silence for a few moments, the only sounds being the low hum of the heater and the occasional drip of rain from the roof. Ethan could feel the unspoken tension between them: fear, relief, frustration, and a lingering uncertainty about what Derek might attempt next. He wanted to ask questions, to seek clarity, yet he recognized that the timing had to be perfect, too soon, and Lydia might feel cornered or defensive, too late, and the chance to gain insight into her intentions could slip away. The balance of trust and observation was delicate, a tightrope that required both patience and intuition. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice low and deliberate. He asked about the nature of Lydia's interactions with Derek, framing his questions carefully to avoid accusation while seeking truth. Lydia's responses were measured, revealing enough to suggest strategy and intent, but withholding critical details that would expose vulnerability. She explained, cautiously, that Derek had been attempting to manipulate events in his favor, leveraging intimidation and subtle coercion to assert control over situations involving both of them. Lydia's words confirmed Ethan's growing suspicion. She was not the architect of malice, but rather a skilled participant navigating dangerous circumstances. As she spoke, Ethan analyzed her body language, micro-expressions, and vocal cues, seeking corroboration between her words and her demeanor. He noticed the way her eyes occasionally darted to the window, the subtle tightness in her hands, the measured pauses in her speech, all indications of awareness, calculation, and controlled emotion. It became clear that Lydia's strength lay not in aggression, but in strategy, the ability to respond with precision and composure under pressure. Ethan felt a mixture of relief and admiration. The woman he loved was not only resilient, but exceptionally capable, navigating a treacherous environment with skill and courage. The conversation shifted to strategy, as Ethan and Lydia began to discuss potential moves and contingencies. Derek's behavior had demonstrated clear patterns of control, and they needed a plan that would allow them to anticipate and counter his manipulations. They considered timing, locations, and the psychological nuances that Derek exploited. Ethan's mind raced as he integrated his observations with Lydia's insights, developing a coordinated approach that balanced vigilance, preparation, and tactical intervention. The discussion was intense, requiring focus, careful reasoning, and an understanding of human behavior at its most subtle and deceptive. As the night progressed, they rehearsed scenarios, anticipating Derek's potential actions and identifying ways to respond effectively. Lydia provided insight into his tendencies, his likely responses to confrontation, and the psychological strategies he employed to assert dominance. Ethan contributed his observations, documenting patterns and potential weaknesses that could be leveraged strategically. The collaboration was meticulous, almost clinical, yet beneath it ran an undercurrent of trust and shared purpose. They were no longer merely navigating danger, they were actively shaping the outcomes, using intelligence and coordination to reclaim agency in a situation that had initially seemed overwhelming. Throughout the process, Ethan became increasingly aware of the depth of Lydia's strength, her calm under pressure, her strategic foresight, and her ability to maintain composure in the face of intimidation were remarkable. He reflected on the whispers from the phone call, realizing that they had been a signal of both peril and resilience. Lydia's words, initially terrifying in their ambiguity, now seemed a subtle acknowledgement of the stakes and a demonstration of her ability to maneuver within them. Ethan's perception shifted. Fear was still present, but it was now tempered by understanding and respect for the complexity of the situation. By the early hours of the morning, Ethan and Lydia had developed a comprehensive plan for the coming days. The steps were deliberate, aimed at observing, anticipating, and countering Derek's actions while preserving their safety and maintaining strategic advantage. Ethan felt a sense of clarity he had not experienced since the initial phone call, a focus sharpened by knowledge, analysis, and collaboration. Yet the underlying awareness remained. Derek was dangerous, unpredictable, and resourceful, and the stakes had never been higher. Every decision, every move could have profound consequences, requiring constant vigilance and precision. Ethan finally allowed himself a brief moment of rest, sitting back and exhaling deeply. The rain had tapered off, leaving the streets glistening under streetlights, a serene contrast to the high-stakes reality he and Lydia were navigating. He understood that the path ahead would demand continued courage, analytical thinking, and unwavering attention to detail. The night's confrontation had illuminated the true dynamics of their struggle, revealing the complexity of manipulation, strategy, and resilience. Yet it also underscored the importance of trust, communication, and coordinated action in overcoming the threats that lay ahead. As dawn approached, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The events of the past days had transformed fear into vigilance, uncertainty into strategic awareness, and observation into coordinated action. The whispered words that had once instilled terror now served as a catalyst for clarity, revealing not only the danger they faced, but also the strength, intelligence, and courage Lydia possessed. Together, they were prepared to confront the challenges ahead, navigate the treacherous terrain of deception and manipulation, and reclaim control over their lives in the face of escalating peril. The next morning, the city felt unusually still, as if holding its breath for what was to come. Ethan had barely slept, his mind replaying every interaction, every subtle cue from the previous days. He reviewed his notes meticulously, cross-referencing observations of Lydia and Derek with timelines and locations. The plan they had devised together the night before felt sound on paper, but Ethan knew that execution would demand more than strategy. It would require nerves of steel, intuition, and split-second decision-making. The stakes had escalated beyond observation. This was now a test of action under pressure. By mid-morning, Ethan positioned himself near the location where he and Lydia had anticipated Derek's next move. A narrow alley behind a quiet row of shops offered both cover and visibility. He crouched behind a stack of crates, camera discreetly ready, every sense alert. The soft drizzle added a muted rhythm to the tension, the reflections of streetlights glimmering on the wet asphalt, casting fractured shadows across the walls. He had learned to interpret these environments not merely as backdrops, but as extensions of the strategic landscape. Every corner, every obstruction, every reflective surface, a tool or hazard in the unfolding scenario. Moments later, Lydia appeared, moving with purposeful calm. Her umbrella shielded her from the rain, yet her eyes were constantly scanning, adjusting to the environment, reading potential threats with the precision of someone who had been forced into a world of constant vigilance. Derek arrived shortly after, exuding the same controlled, commanding presence that had defined his previous interactions. Ethan's pulse quickened. The tension was almost palpable, thick enough to press against the chest. Each movement from Derek signaling subtle intent. Ethan had to remain ready, to react if necessary, while continuing to observe and analyze every nuance of body language, positioning, and exchange. The encounter unfolded like a carefully choreographed performance, each gesture imbued with hidden meaning. Derek directed the conversation, issuing instructions in low tones, his control over the situation almost hypnotic. Lydia responded with measured poise, adjusting subtly to maintain influence and safeguard her position. Ethan's role was silent and observational, yet the responsibility weighed heavily. Any misstep, any lapse in attention could endanger them both. He took notes, recorded subtle micro-expressions, and mentally rehearsed possible interventions without revealing his presence. The scene was tense, cinematic in its intensity, rain dripping rhythmically, amplifying every sound, every movement. Suddenly, Derek's demeanor shifted. A tone of aggression emerged, his gestures sharper, more authoritative, his body language asserting dominance. Ethan's instincts flared. This was the moment when observation had to transition into action. He moved subtly closer, remaining concealed, prepared to intervene if the situation escalated further. Lydia's composure remained. Yet Ethan noticed the flicker of unease in her eyes, the subtle stiffening of her shoulders, the brief hesitation in her gestures. Every detail was critical. Each micro-expression a signal that could guide Ethan's response. The confrontation escalated quickly. Derek advanced toward Lydia, his voice commanding, his posture imposing. Ethan's heart raced, but he maintained a controlled stance, ready to act decisively. He stepped into view at the precise moment, his voice firm yet neutral, instructing Derek to stop and maintain distance. Derek froze momentarily, his confidence challenged by the sudden, unexpected presence of Ethan. Lydia seized the opening, subtly shifting her position, asserting both her awareness and her strategic intent. The tension was electric, the alleyway charged with the interplay of threat, anticipation, and rapid adaptation. Seconds stretched, each movement deliberate and critical. Ethan observed Derek's reactions carefully, noting the slight tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, the recalibration of his stance. Lydia's actions were equally calculated, each gesture reinforcing her agency while mitigating immediate risk. The confrontation, though brief, was a high-stakes negotiation of presence and influence. Derek, sensing his dominance was challenged, gradually retreated, his posture still confident, but now tinged with caution. Ethan exhaled, relief mingling with adrenaline, knowing they had navigated the immediate danger, yet aware that this encounter was only a prelude to further complexities. Returning to the apartment, Ethan felt the weight of the night pressing down, exhaustion tempered by a sharp clarity. He reviewed the events mentally and in notes, recognizing patterns of manipulation and control, evaluating both Lydia's strategic responses and his own actions. The immediate danger had been mitigated, but the underlying dynamics, Derek's manipulations, Lydia's calculated navigation, and the precarious balance of trust and vigilance remained. Ethan realized that safety was provisional, contingent upon continued observation, strategic thinking, and readiness to act when necessary. As the night deepened, Ethan and Lydia debriefed, their conversation focused, analytical, yet infused with a shared sense of relief. Lydia revealed subtleties that Ethan had not observed, insights into Derek's likely strategies, his predictable reactions, and the psychological tactics he employed to assert control. Together, they began refining their approach, planning contingencies, and anticipating potential escalations. The process was intense, demanding focus, patience, and collaboration, yet it strengthened their coordination and mutual understanding. Throughout the night, Ethan reflected on the psychological and emotional dimensions of the encounter. He had assumed betrayal, yet the emerging picture suggested that Lydia's actions were protective, strategic, and calculated. Derek's manipulations had forced them into a high-stakes scenario, and Ethan's vigilance had been essential in navigating the immediate threat. The whispered words from Lydia's phone call, once a source of fear, now seemed a signal, an acknowledgement of danger, and a demonstration of her ability to maneuver within perilous circumstances. By the early hours of the morning, Ethan felt a sense of cautious confidence. The immediate confrontation had been successfully navigated, revealing the depth of Lydia's resourcefulness and the manipulative extent of Derek's influence. The next days would require continued vigilance, careful planning, and strategic engagement. The night's events had clarified roles, revealed dynamics, and reinforced the need for observation combined with decisive action. Ethan understood that while the danger was ongoing, their capacity to respond intelligently and collaboratively had been strengthened. Sitting in the dim glow of the apartment, rain continuing to fall softly outside, Ethan allowed himself a moment of reflection. He recognized that trust, observation, and careful coordination had been the keys to navigating the escalating threat. The whispered words that had once terrorized him had become a catalyst, compelling vigilance, analysis, and strategic engagement. The events of the evening had revealed truths, mitigated immediate danger, and strengthened the partnership between him and Lydia. Yet, they also underscored a simple reality: vigilance, preparation, and courage would remain essential in the unfolding drama. With that understanding, Ethan prepared for the coming days, knowing that each step would require precision, focus, and unwavering commitment. The encounter had provided clarity, but the path ahead remained complex and fraught with risk. The city outside lay quiet, reflecting light on wet streets, mirroring the fragility and unpredictability of the situation within. Ethan felt a renewed determination to protect, to understand, and to confront the dangers that had been revealed, ensuring that both he and Lydia could navigate the challenges ahead with skill, strategy, and courage. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, casting long, thin shadows across the apartment. Ethan sat at the edge of the couch, cup of coffee in hand, replaying the events of the past nights in his mind. The confrontation with Derek, the subtle cues of manipulation, Lydia's careful strategy. It was all a tapestry of tension and risk, woven with precision, yet fraught with uncertainty. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to reflect not only on the danger, but on the resilience and intelligence Lydia had demonstrated. She had moved through peril with calculated composure, and he realized that trust, once fractured, could be rebuilt through understanding and shared experience. He watched Lydia move about the apartment, quiet and deliberate, her expressions controlled but no longer tense. The early hours had brought a rare calm, a momentary reprieve from the storm that had defined the previous days. Ethan's mind traced back to the whispered words from her phone call, words that had sent him spiraling into suspicion and fear. He now understood that those words had been layered, signaling both the gravity of the situation and her awareness of it. There was no malice in her actions, only strategy, self-preservation, and an effort to manage a situation far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. By late morning, Ethan decided it was time to talk openly, to confront the uncertainties and solidify their understanding. He joined Lydia in the kitchen, the faint aroma of brewing coffee filling the space, and spoke in a steady voice, carefully chosen to avoid accusation while inviting honesty. He asked her to explain the dynamics with Derek, to clarify intentions and actions, and to reveal any details he might have missed. Lydia responded with a calm, deliberate narrative, articulating the sequence of events, her strategies to mitigate Derek's manipulations, and the ways in which she had attempted to maintain control without escalating risk. Her words aligned with the patterns Ethan had meticulously observed, confirming the emerging picture of strategic navigation rather than malice. As she spoke, Ethan noticed the subtle indicators he had learned to read. A brief relaxation in her shoulders when discussing safe maneuvers, a fleeting light in her eyes as she described tactical successes, the measured cadence of her voice conveying control and confidence. It was a moment of recognition for Ethan. He saw clearly the depth of Lydia's capability, her mental acuity, and her unwavering composure under pressure. His admiration for her resilience deepened, tempered by the sobering awareness that the threats they faced were not yet fully neutralized. They spent the afternoon reviewing the plan they had developed together, refining contingencies and anticipating Derek's potential responses. Ethan documented timings, locations, and sequences, integrating Lydia's insights and his own observations into a cohesive strategy. The process was meticulous and exhausting, but it strengthened their partnership, transforming mutual fear into coordinated action. Each adjustment, each scenario rehearsal, reinforced trust and shared responsibility, fostering a sense of agency that had been absent during the earlier days of observation and suspicion. By evening, the city had settled into a muted rhythm, the rain tapering to a light mist that shimmered under streetlights. Ethan and Lydia stepped onto the balcony, breathing in the cool air, allowing the quiet of the city to contrast with the high-stakes tension that had dominated their lives. They spoke in hushed tones, reflecting on lessons learned, acknowledging the mistakes and assumptions that had complicated the situation, and appreciating the insights gained from navigating danger together. It was a rare moment of calm, a pause that allowed emotional connection to return alongside strategic clarity. Ethan realized that the events of the past days had reshaped his understanding of trust and perception. He had assumed betrayal, yet the emerging truth was far more nuanced. Lydia's actions had been protective, strategic, and calculated within a web of manipulation orchestrated by Derek. The fear and suspicion that had once consumed him now gave way to a measured understanding, tempered by awareness and grounded in observation. The whispered words from the phone call, once a source of dread, had become a reference point for vigilance, strategy, and mutual coordination. Throughout the evening, they discussed the future, the ongoing need for awareness, and the steps necessary to ensure safety while maintaining agency. Ethan felt a growing sense of partnership, a recognition that trust could be rebuilt through transparency, shared effort, and the careful calibration of actions in high-stakes circumstances. He reflected on the irony. The very words that had initially shattered his sense of security had now become a catalyst for understanding, collaboration, and renewed connection. By nightfall, Ethan and Lydia prepared for rest, the city outside quiet under a canopy of mist and dim light. They had achieved a temporary equilibrium, a pause in the tension that had defined their recent experiences. Ethan felt a cautious optimism, tempered by awareness that challenges remained, but buoyed by the strength, intelligence, and resilience Lydia had demonstrated. Together, they had navigated peril, restored clarity, and reinforced the trust that had been strained by uncertainty and fear. As they finally settled, Ethan allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with potential danger, yet he had witnessed resilience, strategy, and courage firsthand. He understood now that trust was not static, but forged in moments of shared challenge and coordinated action. The whispered words from the phone call had been a warning, a signal, and ultimately a lesson in vigilance, awareness, and partnership. For the first time in days, Ethan felt the fragile but growing sense of hope that clarity, trust, and connection could be restored even amidst the shadows of manipulation and danger. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the apartment, a stark contrast to the tension and uncertainty that had dominated the past days. Ethan sat across from Lydia at the small kitchen table, the quiet hum of the city outside a gentle counterpoint to the storm they had just weathered. The immediate danger posed by Derek Hayes had been neutralized, his manipulations exposed, and the careful coordination between them had shifted the balance of power. The sense of relief was profound, yet tempered by the knowledge that the events they had navigated would leave lasting marks on trust, on perception, and on the fragile equilibrium of their lives. Ethan reflected on the path that had led them to this moment. The whispered words from Lydia's phone call had ignited a sequence of vigilance, observation, and strategic engagement that had ultimately revealed the complexity of their situation. What had initially seemed like betrayal was, in truth, a test of resilience, a navigation of threats orchestrated by an external manipulator. Lydia's composure, intelligence, and courage had been critical, demonstrating a capacity for strategic thinking and emotional fortitude that Ethan had not fully appreciated until now. Together, they had learned to interpret subtle cues, anticipate manipulations, and coordinate responses, transforming fear into actionable clarity. As they reviewed the events in detail, Ethan noted the lessons embedded in each encounter. Derek's behavior had been calculated, exploiting both opportunity and perception to assert control. Yet the most critical revelation lay in Lydia's responses, the ability to remain calm under pressure, to communicate effectively through micro-expressions and gestures, and to strategize within constraints that could have overwhelmed less capable individuals. Ethan felt a deep respect for her resilience. Recognizing that trust had been rebuilt, not through assumption or emotion, but through observation, collaboration, and shared purpose. The afternoon brought a quiet sense of closure. Ethan and Lydia walked together through the nearby park, the sunlight breaking through clouds that had lingered for days. The crisp air and gentle rustling of leaves provided a soothing backdrop, contrasting sharply with the tension-filled streets and alleys they had navigated in previous encounters. They spoke quietly, reflecting on the interplay of fear, perception, and strategy that had defined the past week. The conversation was candid, analytical, and infused with a renewed understanding of each other's capabilities, priorities, and limits. Ethan felt a renewed sense of partnership, grounded in mutual respect and recognition of the challenges they had faced together. By evening, Derek's influence had been effectively neutralized, his manipulations exposed and documented. Legal steps were initiated to ensure accountability, and Ethan and Lydia were able to begin reclaiming a sense of normalcy. The fear that had haunted their nights gradually subsided, replaced by a cautious optimism and a recognition that their coordinated efforts had preserved both safety and autonomy. The apartment, once a place of tension and uncertainty, now felt like a space of restoration, where clarity and strategy had realigned with trust and shared purpose. Ethan took time to reflect on the emotional journey they had endured. The initial shock of Lydia's whispered words, the ensuing days of surveillance and observation, the direct confrontations with Derek, and the strategic planning all converged into a profound lesson about resilience, perception, and partnership. He recognized that true trust was not merely an assumption or a belief, but an active engagement cultivated through communication, vigilance, and the shared navigation of complex challenges. Lydia's intelligence and courage had been essential, but so too had Ethan's perseverance and analytical rigor, forming a complementary dynamic that had allowed them to reclaim control. As night fell, Ethan and Lydia sat together on the balcony, the city lights reflecting softly on the wet streets below. The rain had tapered to a gentle drizzle, the mist creating a reflective, almost cinematic atmosphere. They shared a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had endured, a silent recognition of the resilience and collaboration that had carried them through peril. There was a sense of closure, yet also a sober awareness that vigilance and strategic awareness would remain necessary components of their lives. The whispered words that had once instilled fear now served as a reminder of the importance of observation, trust, and coordinated action. Ethan felt a profound sense of gratitude and relief. The danger had been mitigated, the manipulations exposed, and their relationship had emerged stronger, tempered by the crucible of shared challenge. He understood that the lessons learned extended beyond immediate threats. The importance of patience, careful observation, strategic thinking, and emotional resilience. The events had revealed vulnerabilities, yet they had also illuminated strengths, demonstrating that even in the face of deception and manipulation, clarity, trust, and courage could prevail. In the quiet of the night, Ethan and Lydia reflected on their journey. The whispered phone call that had ignited fear now symbolized a turning point, a catalyst for vigilance, understanding, and renewed trust. They had faced danger together, navigated uncertainty, and emerged with both clarity and strengthened partnership. The city outside, calm under the soft glow of streetlights, mirrored the internal resolution they had achieved. Ethan knew that challenges would continue to arise, yet he felt confident in their shared capacity to confront them, guided by strategy, awareness, and mutual trust. As they prepared to close the day, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey through fear, manipulation, and uncertainty had culminated in understanding, partnership, and resilience. Derek's schemes had been thwarted, Lydia's agency recognized, and their bond reaffirmed. The whispered words from the phone call, once a source of dread, had become a symbol of vigilance, strategy, and shared strength, a reminder that even the most insidious threats could be navigated with courage, intelligence, and collaboration. In the quiet moments before sleep, Ethan reflected on the transformation that had occurred. Fear had given way to clarity, suspicion to understanding, and uncertainty to coordinated action. The experiences had reshaped his perception of trust, revealing that true partnership was forged not merely in comfort, but in the crucible of challenge. The whispered words from Lydia's phone call had been the spark, but it was their combined courage, intelligence, and resilience that had allowed them to reclaim control, neutralize the threat, and restore a sense of equilibrium in their lives. Life often presents situations where trust is tested and perception can be deceiving. Ethan and Lydia's journey teaches us that appearances are not always what they seem, and that true resilience arises from vigilance, strategic thinking, and collaboration. Betrayal or danger may lurk in shadows, but careful observation, courage, and mutual support can reveal the truth and restore trust. The most profound lessons emerge from navigating uncertainty together, facing fears with clarity, and acting decisively when necessary. If you found their story compelling, share your thoughts in the comments and let us know how you would respond in a situation like theirs. Don't forget to subscribe to follow more thrilling, emotional stories where courage and trust are tested to the limit.